The final talk that we have on experiment state today is by Professor Sonja Vogt, who is an associate professor of sustainable social development at the University of Bern. So we're very excited to be able to bring her all the way from Switzerland to the UK to give a talk to us. She was previously at the Center for Experimental Social Sciences here at Nuffield College, and before that she was at the University of Zurich in the Department of Economics. Sonja does very interesting work using experimental methodology, especially field experiments, to study things that are tricky to measure and topics that are culturally sensitive, such as female genital cutting and prenatal sex selection. And she studies and runs field experiments in many different parts of the world, including having done them in Sudan, in Armenia, and in other places. And today she's going to talk to us about eliciting data in challenging intercultural settings by using mobile labs. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. It's really nice, and it's pretty challenging to be on Saturday at 4 o'clock. I try my best also to be on time. So of course, you can also ask questions in between. I might be a little more rigorous than Ray was, just really by trying to get you all out at 5 here. As Lily already said, I will talk basically about how we can use mobile labs, or what's really the advantage of using mobile labs with respect to development research. I guess you're all familiar with this idea that it's long ago that the gold standard has been established in a way that you have to run an RCT if you want to have a reasonable, or you want to have an impact data collection, an impact measurement. And there was a lot of focus on how we do that right. How can we avoid attrition? How do you really randomize in the field? How do you negotiate with your partner in the field if it's a phase-in design, a true lottery design, and all of this? So there was lots of research and lots of discussion about how do we really do that. And that shifted in the last couple of years a bit more in a way that behavioral science got stronger and stronger with respect to development science. And what I mean with that is that there was really this trend where people, first of all, argue that we have to understand the behavior in the field better. So it's not just the standard about we have to give the right incentives, we have to give people information. So it was really moving into we have to understand these behavioral biases. So behavioral science was used as a diagnostic tool to inform the programs. That means the programs also changed. It's not just I give you money for you sending your child to school, or I explain you that it's good to use fertilizer and then you do it, but now it's all about role models. It's about how we change social norms. And this is what I'm talking about, that led to a pressure also on the side of impact data collection. So if a lot of the interventions are now about telling you what to do, I cannot just afterwards ask you what you're doing, because then it's very obvious what you're saying. So there is really a shift towards trying to improve measurements in the field as a consequence of using a lot of behavioral-driven informative program work by now. And this is a little bit the problem as you see it here. So there might be, if you use a self-report, or also if you don't use a self-report, the challenge is really that as soon as there's an intervention, a lot of interventions are also media interventions now. There is a big telenovela running that's really repeatedly telling you that it's not the right thing to circumcise your girls. So you can then come to a situation where people are completely aware what the desirable, the socially desirable behavior is. And you need to be able as a scientist to disentangle just increased awareness from behavioral or attitudinal change. And this is basically what I have to do in my research quite a lot, and this is what I'm talking about today. It's probably true in all kinds of topics in development, also when you study poverty or something that's really more incentive-based. But it's definitely a challenge when you have this kind of socially or culturally sensitive behaviors. Like Lily said already, female genital cutting is such a topic. It's almost in any country you go, everybody has learned that when we are coming, I say like, the aid agencies are coming, that we do not want to hear that you support female genital cutting. So the first ladies of countries often, talk about it, but it's never really, it's not really, you're not punished if you if you keep on doing it, even though it's illegal in most countries. It's similar with prenatal sex selection in Armenia and in the Southern Caucasus. Everybody knows by now. UNFPA made one kind of big campaign and then tells everybody that this is the wrong thing to do. And other topics I study is corruption in higher education or exclusion of people with disabilities. So these are all topics where where it's really challenging to disentangle awareness after a campaign from a real attitudinal change. We also had, this is, I think what Ridi also referred to, measuring the tricky things. We had a workshop here too, together with the behavioral team of the World Bank, where we basically asked exactly this question. How do we actually know if we measure what we think we are measuring? How do we figure that out? And I want to talk about the first 3 points here. So there are different points how you can avoid this social desirability bias, that people tell you basically what you want to hear, that people try to anticipate what's good for them. Maybe they think if I say I stop circumcising, I have some advantages in another domain because the same aid program is also providing other services. And I will talk about mainly how privacy can help, how indirect measurement methods can help, and how giving incentives can help. And all of this is very easily done, or maybe not very easily, but it's done when you use mobile labs, because they give you all 3 of them. I'm not talking a lot about the other 2. I have just one slide. That's a more statistical measurement methods. But since I'm coming from the lab, I only talk about the first 3. But this is an example about the list experiment. This is what was often done before you basically went to this richer data collection that I talk about today, where you would basically ask a direct question. This is how basically all the time the DHS had asked a question about circumcising the girl, very direct and often in face-to-face interviews. It's always the same argument. People can't really read and write. What shall we do? We can't just send surveys out like we do in Europe and hope many people respond, send it back. So you basically sit in front of a person, interview a person, and probably 2/3 of the extended family standing around and listening to the answers. And then they develop methods like the list experiment, where you ask, let's say, 5 questions that are not related to the sensitive topic. And then this is the control group. You only ask people to report how many answers are yes. And then you compare it to a treatment group where you add the sensitive question. And then you can kind of, measure the biases. This is not very useful if you're really interested in randomized controlled trials, because it's on an aggregate level. And that's also why I'm not talking about these methods. And then there was another study that's pretty interesting by Shushad. He ran an experiment where he basically, with an experiment, wanted to figure out what privacy actually means, why privacy really helps with social desirability biases. So he had a study in India where he asked some question about the caste system, where he knew how many questions would be desirable and how many people would answer truly. And he did face-to-face interviews. Well, now I'm touching it too. He did face-to-face interviews, and then he did the same interviews with an MP3 player where people were just listening to the questions, and then they had a sheet, very simple, where they would give an answer if they agree or disagree. And what was nice is then he varied the MP3 method. So he would use a situation where you really don't give the results back to the interviewer to test an interviewer effect. He changed the formulation, whether it was more in the first order, a more direct or more an indirect question. And then he also used earphones versus speakers, so people around you would all listen to the question, or you would only listen to it on your own. So this is testing the bystander effect. And what was interesting is that was the most important effect. So when everybody could hear the question, the number of socially desirable answers would really go up. And that I found interesting, because this is very often true in most of the data collection we look at, that people are not really on their own. It's not just the interviewer. It's really, you ask women about domestic violence, and maybe the husband of your wife is just next door, and they can all just hear what you say. And we know this has also led to a serious backlash in some studies. So I'm talking about basically how privacy can help when you use computerized lab in the field experiments. I don't know if I need to tell a lot about lab in the field experiments. I guess you all have heard about it today already a little bit. It's basically the same like lab experiment, but you take it into the field. That means you probably have an informative, theoretically informed subject pool. So maybe you're interested in, there's a famous study that shows that bankers are actually not self-selecting into risky behavior, but they have a culture that makes them taking risky choices. You wouldn't get the bankers in Zurich in our lab, so we had to take the lab to the bankers to not steal so much of their time. So this is definitely an advantage, but it's still a very high experimental control. You know who's doing what. And this is what I talk about. It's nice for interdependent research, and it's nice to provide this critical privacy that what I also personally think we very often just take away from certain people, because we have this, I mean, I heard many stories of good papers, but often people say, well, they couldn't read and write, what should I do? So it's just a few studies I did. We wanted to see how social preference develop in children. There was a study done by Ernst Fair many years ago, but they basically had an experimenter who would trade with the children Gummibärchen and other sweets. And we tried to replicate it, but really in a way where it was anonymous, and people and kids were really behind the computer. They were 4 to 8 years old, but we programmed in a really nice way and tried to see how that works. And this is a study I'm talking today most of the time about. There was a study done in Sudan with people who have not used computers before, most of them, and with kind of small-scale farmers, and with people who also really needed audio recording. And so here you see we built up a mobile lab, and people were, at the end, being able to do pretty complicated tasks on their own behind the computer. And that's probably also already my main take-home message, that this is actually possible. It's a bit more work on our side, but I would encourage everybody to do that. So the first study is about female genital cutting. Just very little background. Here you see where most of the cutting takes place in the world. We worked in Sudan. The reason is that we did it in Sudan. There are different types of cutting. It's always a removal of female genital organs for non-medical reason. But in Sudan, they use type 3. That means they remove all the organs, and then they kind of stitch it together, and it's growing together in that way. So this is the one where health issues have been documented. And for many other reasons, we chose to work in Sudan. Just a little background to the study. So the policy basically assumes that female genital cutting is a coordination game, in a way that people are forced to coordinate on one equilibrium or on the other. So either everybody cuts or nobody cuts. I spare you all the details, but it's a pretty well-established theoretical discussion about it. Is this really the case or not? And we wanted to test that, and that means we wanted to test it in a way that we thought, okay, if this is true and people coordinate on one or the other equilibrium, you should, at the aggregate level, have this specific path-dependent dynamics where either everybody cuts or nobody cuts. So our first measurement problem we could not solve with computerized methods. It was basically, we wanted to estimate the cutting rates in villages in Sudan and see if we can have this distribution, that we have this discontinuity in communities that cut and communities that do not cut. And again, I don't go into the details, but we figured out that there is actually a visible signal, because in Sudan and in many other countries too, even with medical exams, you wouldn't get that through the ethics committee or whatever you want to call it, through the government, I would rather call it, not the ethics committee. But we found out that all the girls are circumcised in the same week, namely 2 weeks before they go to school for the first time, and that they get henna painted on their feet on the day of the circumcision, and the henna does not grow out of, does not wash out of the toenails, so it has to grow out, and we had a window. It was far more complicated than this, but in a nutshell, we just counted how many girls per school had henna on their feet and estimated the cutting rate. And then what you see here is the ordered cutting rate of all the communities, and you see there is no discontinuity. We have cutting rates of all type between 20 and 80% basically. That does not surprise you now so much, because I didn't give you a whole lot of background, but this led to a lot of arguing with UNICEF, who financed all of this too, because this really goes against all the program works that they have built on this idea that it's a coordination game and you shift people from one equilibrium to the other. So we didn't find that, but now I'm coming back to the topic of the presentation. So we had this very unusual measurement now with the henna feet. which only works one time a year in these 2 weeks. And it's very hard to take that as an impact data collection. I mean, you have to really time it very well, and then you don't know how long before that period you should have an intervention or not. So what we were thinking, how we can have a more measurement that you can scale up better, that correlates hopefully with the HENA data. And then we thought, okay, we try to do an implicit association test. I guess the people who are psychologists know it. It's a pretty established test in psychology, also critically discussed there, but lately used a lot by development economists. And the idea is that you basically work with reaction time instead of asking people directly. You present a neutral stimuli and a valued stimuli to people, and then you try to let them categorize this and measure the reaction time. I give you an example afterwards. So it's in a way an indirect measure. It's rather complicated to do. And the challenge was, how can we do it with a subject pool as we had, where people are really not exposed to work with a computer ever before and where people can't read and write. So we thought we nevertheless try it. And this is, I go through it with you. This was basically the idea. In an IIT, you get first introduced to a neutral stimuli, and this should be neutral. This is a circumcised girl and a girl that's not circumcised. It's very clear for Sudanese people, because a piece of cotton they circumcise, the cloth that circumcised daughters has exactly this pattern. So there is a lot of qualitative, informative work that goes into this project that I'm not talking about today. But anyway, we introduced these two girls, and then you see here the girls should be neutral, and then we added with a valued stimuli, namely a negative and a positive stimuli, and then you categorize them. Here the cut girl is combined with a negative stimuli, the uncut girl with a positive one, and then either images of the girls popping up or people hear a bad or a positive word. And then you had only two buttons to press, a pink one and a blue one, and you had to do it as fast as possible. And we measure reaction time, and we also measure the error rate. And then you reverse the pairing, and you do the same again. So I guess the intuition is clear. You really slow down if this is not how you feel about it. And if this is how you feel about it, that it's bad to be circumcised, then this task is much easier for you. You can test many of those at the Harvard webpage, and about different religion, women in science, and all kinds of stuff. And I guess with some of them you really feel maybe what I mean, that it's just slowing you down a millisecond, and that accumulates over time. So this is basically, yeah?
So could you just repeat again what's the slowing down part?
With the IIT?
Yeah, just here was the intuition behind slowing down.
Yeah. So the
Thank
question,
you.
yeah.
Would you like to, could you again repeat the intuition behind the slowing down part?
Yeah. So the idea is basically, let's assume you think it's bad to be circumcised, and it's good, it's not to be circumcised, and it's good to be cut. And then those images or words coming up, then this is how you're aligned with it. It's easier for you to press the same button for a positive word and for a cut girl. It's harder for you to do this task because it goes against your implicit association, and this is why it's just a little harder. There has been lots of meta-analysis, and this works the best with an uninformed subject pool. It would be probably harder if I do something about racism with you guys now, because somehow you might figure it out and you try impulsively to go against it because you want to even hide it in this task. There's lots of discussion, is this task really working or not? It seems to really work the best with people that haven't done that before, that haven't also thought about this a whole lot. And then you really just, with the reaction time, pick up this difference in the implicit attitude. That's basically the idea. And it's a pretty complex task. You do it first for one pairing, then you have to do some intermediate stuff to get this out of their head, and the other one. So why I wanted to present it here, because this is something everybody told us you can't do that. It just doesn't work. It's crazy to do that in Sudan. And at the end, we went to 144 communities. We had a lab with 50 computers. We had 24 hours, 7 days a week security with us. But this is really the message I want to bring here. You can do that. It's just a bit more work on your side, but it's worth it in the way, because it's first of all, also valuing people, that you not just think, well, I can ask you about your sexual behavior and your mom is sitting next to you and I just don't care. We wouldn't do that, we wouldn't go away with that in any country like Switzerland. If you try that, people would never let you into their house. So this is a nice way of trying to also be a bit more taking privacy serious on topics that matter for people in other places. And here's the result. So you see it's also very similar to the henna feed. We don't have a discontinuity. We don't have a group that's clearly pro-cutting and clearly against cutting. The IIT score is basically going from 2 to -2, and that means you're in favor of cutting, and this means you're in favor of non-cutting. And what's important is that we could show that this correlates with the henna feed. So it was not the same people, it was randomly selected people from the communities. But this then did allow us to use this method basically to run it behind a randomized controlled trial, because we have developed 2 new methods and we were kind of confident that we can rely on it because it's picking up the same stuff. This was important because we got, of course, not criticized, but the henna feed is a nice idea, it worked very well, but it's nothing that you can just use a whole lot if you're really interested in attitudinal change later on. So we did that, and then I make, just for a bit more fun, I make a little thing where I don't talk about methods, but just showing you why this was important that we have developed this as a method.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, just as a question. So the implicit, the scale, the IAT, so what does it mean? If it's 0.3, it means?
Well, yeah, you see it here. This is just mean. This is basically, it goes from 2 to -2,
okay.
And +2 is you're really in favor of non-cutting, and -2 means you're in favor of cutting, and 0 is you kind of have a neutral attitude.
Okay, and you know that this is not just random because it correlates with the actual measure of...
that was important for us. I mean,
yeah.
That's also the message here, right? If you develop new methods, you hopefully can validate them somehow towards each other. We also did that in this is over all 144 communities, but we also did it for each community individually.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the choice in the implicit association test was either positive or negative. There wasn't a middle.
No, you can't have that there. You have basically 2 valued stimuli and 2 neutral ones. And if you do that, you should probably, well, maybe you're even in favor of not cutting, but the girls are neutral. A cut girl and an uncut girl is a neutral. It should be a neutral stimuli.
Yeah.
That's the idea behind it.
Got it. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Just a little excursus what you can do with it. And so we had the fun of producing 4 different movies in Sudan. Then the idea was that we wanted to have, again, a very mild intervention where we basically used the results from the first paper and showed that, well, people who cut and don't cut live door to door. So we can produce a movie now where we just use their own arguments, discussing it out without us coming talking about something like this is a violation of human rights or something like this. So we just produced 4 movies, and we run 2 experiments. We run one where we were very risk averse, where we just let people watch the movie on their own in the lab, and then directly afterwards run the implicit association test to see if there is an immediate effect, depending if you see a movie where we discuss female genital cutting or you see a movie where we don't talk about it at all, it's a control movie. They were to 75% identical, so it was a really, really, really mild intervention. And then we got these results. I show them to you in a minute. And then we got more courageous and we said, okay, now we can also randomly assign the movies to communities, which is, of course, a much bigger study. You have 144 communities. You make public viewing in every community. You randomly select 60 people per community. You measure the attitudes before, you show the movie, and you measure the attitudes afterwards. And here you see the results again. So this is the IIT score again. And here you have the control movie and 3 experimental movies. And this is the big study where we randomized at the community level. And you see directly after the movie, the attitudes are more in favor of non-cutting in comparison to the control movie where nothing seemed to have changed. And then interestingly though, in the field study, we could wait 1 week because we didn't have spillover effects because it was randomized at the community level. And the other one, of course, if you just wait an hour, everybody talks to each other. And I do think spillover effects have serious effects, and you should try to avoid them whenever you can. That's why we randomized at community level, and then you actually see that only one of the 3 experimental movies still has an effect a week afterwards. Which is also nice in a way that it's also with implicit association tests. So we did it really a week after they watched the movie, and then we see that actually only one of the movie has a lasting effect. Yeah.
Excuse me, I don't know if I missed it, but in the movies, are they like the same, and then the actors did another scene or different
Exactly,
dialogue
yeah.
that you directed, something like that?
Yeah, I was really short
okay.
on this. This is really because it's not really a lot about the talk I'm trying to give here, but the idea is that basically we had a Sudanese writer who would write the movie, and we would experimentally constrain him a little bit. So in the control movie, it was just like any good movie about love and drama and rejection and anything. And then in the other 3, we had 30% of the movie talking about, in a non-judgmental way, really the pro and cons about cutting. So it's like you would listen to your neighbor secretly who talks about it in a very non-scientific way, but it was scientific in the way how we manipulated the argument. So in one movie, you would talk about your private values. In another movie, it was just about coordination incentives. So it was basically the elements of a coordination game, preferences versus coordination incentives, were tested against each other, and the winning movie is the one where both were in. So coordination incentive seems to matter, but private values also seem to matter. That was the idea. And I would say, Sudanese people told me if you would watch the movies without the sound, you would probably not even be able to say the difference, because we try to keep it as constant as possible. Another example I wanted to give you to show you again how you how if you really want to, how you can actually collect very rich behavioral data under very culturally challenging circumstances. And this is about prenatal sex selection in Armenia. That's actually how Ridi and I met, because we have a shared interest in this topic. Here you just see an overview. It's already from end 2010. It's from a paper 2015, where you see how postnatal and prenatal selection influence the story about the missing females. And you see that prenatal sex selection is actually going up. And the idea is, at least in the Southern Caucasus, the idea is, because several things come together, it's a decline in fertility, it's an improvement of methods. You can detect the gender of your child earlier and earlier. And in that way, there is this idea, at least UNICEF has this worry, that if the methods is getting more and more in this direction and fertility goes down and people have a son preference, that you find it in many other places too, where people just try to basically affect the situation and ensure they have a son by aborting the females. And Armenia is a very nice example of how you can have this problem of desirability. So they basically figured out that they have a problem with that. Somewhere in 2010, there were a lot of data published by a demographer, Gilmotto, who could really show that the sex ratio of births got in some regions that more than 150 boys are born on 100 girls. And so they could somehow, they had to do something, and then they did a lot of media campaign, not with scientists, just telling everybody it's better to have a son preference and that you should not have a son preference and that you should be favoring girls and boys in the same way. And this is not really exclusive. It's not really showing a clear result. This is just out of their report. It's not a scientific report. But they basically asked families what kind of gender their child should have. If they had one child, what gender it should have. And then they did the same 2011 and 2016, and green means I don't have a preference. And you see that there was a big change. And this is what I meant before. That doesn't mean, of course, that there is a change. There was not a change in the sex ratio at birth, but this is how you see how especially what we do now all the time, how media campaigns and all of this, not set up in combination with a randomized controlled trial, can lead to situations like this, where it's just for a scientist extremely hard to work with it. And we kind of started this study somewhere in the middle, so this was very unfortunate for us. We kind of stopped it then, because you can't run an RCT in a situation like this in a small country where everybody knows within a week what you're supposed to say. So we said, okay, what we do now is we don't do an RCT, but we really, again, trying to develop measurement methods that in this situation works. And I do think this is a really nice example for a really challenging situation. Small country, big media campaign, UNFPA was behind it, the European Union was behind it. How do you now really figure out what's going on? And it's an interesting case because women are actually pretty well educated in Armenia. They also participate in the labor market. So we really wanted to try to understand why do they have this outrageous imbalance in the sex ratio at birth. So again, we decided that we would work with mobile labs here. In Armenia, it wasn't possible to get people in a lab for several reasons. So we basically built little mobile labs in people's houses. And that was important because we wanted to interview the wife, the husband, and the husband's mother. All the programs focusing on the husband's mother. This is the common wisdom somehow. UNICEF focuses on it, that this is a driving force behind prenatal sex selection. So we said we want to run a little lab study with all three of them in parallel to make sure they, again, not one stands behind the other when you give an answer. That was the reason we couldn't get people in the labs. They all said we never leave the house all three at the same time. Somebody has to be at home. What do we do with the kids? So we had really mini labs of 3 computers that we built up in 900 different households in Armenia and collected data where on the one hand we wanted to have explicit measures, detailed preferences on the sex distribution of the children and other stuff. Then we wanted to have an implicit measure again, the implicit association test. And we also worked with incentivized methods here, as I will show you in a minute, because that can also, of course, help to really go to the true attitudes or the true behavior. I wanted to just talk very shortly about the IAT again, because you cannot just test with it whether there is a positive or a negative attitude towards something. You can also test stereotypes. And that's a nice way, too, to do development research, because in a way they're coming from somewhere. And if you do a campaign, it's maybe also a more subtle way to see if you actually did do some changes here. The stereotypical IAT we run in Armenia is based on this kind of saying that they say that the boys are ours and the girls belong to the others. And this is the idea that the boys stay with you. But if you have a girl, you marry her off, and that's it, basically. So she's not really very useful at that point anymore. So we used, and here you probably see now that for you, if you don't think that way, this should be a really weird IAT for you. So instead of positive, negative terms, we have terms that on the one hand show flourishing. That means you extend your family, you're still somehow there. And then we have lots of words that I found it a weird IAT, to be honest. I don't even really know how to do that one, where it's about abruptly ending the family line, kind of. And then we did the similar stuff again, where we had a family with only boys and a family with only girls. And then you have the words down, whether you continue the family or you don't. And again, you have images or you hear different of those words. Then we reverse the coding again. It's the same story as before. And we measure, again, the IAT score. And just shortly about the results, it's again from 2 to 2. It's the same. It's basically a program you buy, and it's always working in the same way, which is nice because then it's nice to compare when other people use it too. And we did it for a valence one, where it's just positive and negative, and for a stereotype that I just explained to you. And you just, again, don't really, this data also just came in 2 weeks ago. And I don't want to go into the details. I really want to talk about the methods. But what's interesting is in our data, very systematically across all the different regions, and also in the IAT for valence and for stereotypes, it looks like the husbands are the problem, so to say. The husbands have a strong preference for a boy, and the husbands seem to be very much leaning into the stereotype and not the mother-in-law so much. And now we feel like, again, we are kind of ready after we understood all of this data, maybe doing an RCT now, because now we maybe have we convinced that we can disentangle this awareness from the other stuff. But because it's more complicated in Armenia, because we know there was this big campaign that reached everybody, we also did a lot of other measurements for son preferences that we then at the end, again, trying to validate one for the other and not just, developing an IAT and run it afterwards. And also here it was very useful that we worked with computerized methods, because typically the DHS is measuring son preferences in a way where it first asks you, if you could go back to the time you did not have children and could choose exactly the number of children to have in your whole life, how many would that be? And then they ask you, based on this answer, how should be the sex composition? And of course, it's a very problematic question. It's conditioning, first of all, on the family size, you say. If you say 3, you can't really reveal an unbalanced preference anymore. If you say 2 and you have a slight son preference, it's very extreme to say son-son, and you might say son-daughter. And of course, if the family size varies across different regions, the preference for the family size, you also have lots of noise there. And again, all of this was done in privacy. We managed to do all of this in a way that people could do it on their own. Of course, this was not as hard as in Sudan. They could all read the things, although we audio recorded everything too at the same time. And then we did basically here what you showed, we used an indirect measurement. So first of all, we asked them about the family composition of the youngest child. So you don't have this problem that you basically have to rationalize in a way that you already have 3 children, but you really think 2 would be best, but you don't really want to say that, because then you feel like you kind of, are unfair or mean, or you say something really bad towards your 3rd child. So we worked with a hypothetical case where we asked them about basically what would be the right size and the composition for the youngest child. And we could also, because it was computerized on the paper, you could never move all of this in a way that the person could handle it on its own. So we could program it in a way that we ask what's the perfect family size, and we had lots of questions where people would forget about this question. And then in a random order, we would ask different people about, if you have 1 child, what's the perfect sex position? If you have 2, if you have 3, if you have 4. So again, this was extremely easy in a way, if you think about it hard enough, to program it in a way that these people could really do it without that they needed help for it, because the program would do everything for you. And in that way, it was also nice, again, that there was no bystander effect and no interviewer effect too. Because just to give you a short anecdote, we work with the National Statistical Service of Armenia, and they do all the DHS data and all of this. And they were telling us that we get the best interviewer. Maybe I shouldn't do that when I'm actually recorded. Anyway, they said we get the best interviewer they have. And then, when I trained them, there were a couple of men that came to me and said, hey, you just tell me the answer you want. I get any answer that you tell me you want in your questionnaire. So we thought, yet another reason to have computerized methods and leave the interviewer out as much as possible. And I mean, they had their best intention, right? I don't even mean it as a criticism. It's more like people have other ideas about how they want to get their data together, I guess. Just also very shortly, so you see, of course, this is all done on their own, and you get a lot more insights, because one of the key questions also, is it a preference for a son, or is it a preference for the more sons, the better? And so, for instance, we see if it's just 1 child, everybody obviously wants a son. These are the different regions. The 3 character, husband, wife, mother-in-law. But then if you ask them 2 children, they all want a son and a daughter. So it's not just the more sons, the better. And then I personally think it's getting really interesting here when you have 3 children, or even if you ask for 4, there are endless many combinations. And people seem to be relatively clear. This area is a little different. The sex ratio at birth is much lower, much more even than in these 2. But what's interesting is everybody seems to be sure that the first one has to be a son, and nobody wants something like even daughter, son, daughter, daughter, or something like this. So I think if you program all of this, I think it's a much richer data set. It's also treating the people with more respect instead of just asking them all of this directly. Then the last methods I want to talk about, the remaining few minutes, is vignette studies where you use incentives. Because if you use incentives, of course, you can also really go for the true answer in the way that you can't if you don't give incentives. And I guess most of you know how vignettes work, so you have a little background story. In our case, people would listen to a story about a couple. They have 2 daughters. They're planning to have their 3rd and last child. We put the age in a way where it was clear to people that chances are not increasing anymore. And then they find out that they're pregnant and she has a girl. And then in a vignette, you very different experimental treatments, so to say. So you can vary the financial security that they think the daughter would be useful in the past, in the future, or we marry the lineage or different things. And then we also vary if people do abort or they don't abort. And then you ask people basically their private opinion, and you can also ask them beliefs about what other people would answer. And if you don't do this in privacy, so we have everything combined here. It's an indirect measure from the wording. We provide an incentive, as you see now. And again, they could do it completely on their own with audio recordings, without anybody listening or watching them, so to say. And what's nice about this is, so you ask them, what do you think about the choice of the couple? Let's assume we said they believe that the daughter is financially securing them and they decided to abort. Then you ask them, are you happy, sad, or very happy, very sad for the family? And this is just their private opinion. And what you do in incentivized vignettes, you basically let them play a coordination game in a way that you say, okay, now we're interested in what you think a specific other group did. So it's like you're trying to measure perceived social norms, people say it is, or a focal point. And in that way, we basically tell them, we did the same study, the same question with other women. If you correctly guess what another woman answered, you get, I don't know, $10. And like this, you disentangle this kind of stuff that you're not trying to be consistent. You don't try to rationalize that. You say, well, everybody thinks like I do. The incentives are pretty high. They know that they immediately get it via air minutes on their phone. We made that clear. We showed that before in the beginning of the study. They trusted us at this point. And again, this is, for a development context, a pretty elaborate way of collecting data, of doing a lot of effort, of trying to disentangle this stuff of awareness versus really a behavioral and attitudinal change. And this is, I think, what I'm really just going, we don't have results and ones where I don't show results. It's really, just to summarize it, I think there's really this big trend that we're really convinced now that it's just not enough to tell people what's right to do. Information alone clearly doesn't need to change, at least not with those topics. We also know that just giving incentives is not always enough. It's just not enough to change the incentive structure. It's also not enough to do conditional cash transfer or unconditional cash transfer. So the idea is really, if the programs are so heavily relying on a normative language somehow telling you what's best to do, establishing role models and all of these things, working with mental model shifts, then you do need to get a better measurement. And I think this is really the trend, that you also use mobile apps, and then you work with incentives, you work with privacy, you can have interdependent situations, and not being, and not saying I can't do that because people have never seen a computer, people can't read and write, this is a really hard situation. So I would encourage everybody to always think that this is your job to sort that out and not the job of the people, so to say. Thank you.
Do you have any questions? I think Nicolo has the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. I really loved it all. It was really great. But I wanted to ask, how did you run pilot studies on these things? Like, how long has it taken you to set up this final body of work, for example? Because I know I do field experiments and they take forever. And did you also run pilots? And I guess linked to some of this is, how much confusion did you generate amongst the participants? In that, did you, it's linked to pilots in that if you did a pilot to find out what they do and do not understand, you then went back, etc.
Yeah, so they take long. I wouldn't do the Sudan study during my PhD, probably not. You also depend on other people, so you know it's not just on me. But of course there is a lot of piloting, but also what I would call material production, right? That's really important. In Sudan, the movie production took forever, writing the script and then arguing with a very talented writer because I wanted a bit more artificial to get my different treatments and all of this. The IIT looks also easy once you present it, but it's incredible in some countries how long it takes to get an IIT sketch that you can use. In Armenia, they always look like the Kardashians, and we kept telling they have to look like a family with no social economic background and all of this. I mean, that all matters, of course. But working with the activists, with the people, I mean, being an artist in Sudan means you're an activist. So we have a lot of pre-testing in that way, of course. Are the girls equally likely? It starts there. But then what we did is when we had all the methods together, we also really pre-tested the procedure in a way, because exactly we didn't want what you said when we went in the final 144 communities. I was never there. I had at that point 60 data collectors trained, and they were a bit hierarchical. There was a study oversee person, and it went down, and then 4 people were supervised by 1, and all of this. Because I think I can really say what people reported. At the end, people found it fun. You know, we came in there, we had these big computers and built up in a school. They also got rewarded for a full day because they couldn't do what they normally would do. So I think actually I saw some video footage the government took, and it did never really look chaotic. It was really like people understood. And this is the difference why I don't use list experiments. So I think the message was clear. This might be a topic of sensitivity. I'm interested in your opinion. But I don't really care. I don't record what you really do. I will never ask you directly, do you continue to circumcise your daughters? I think people understood in a way that we're interested in something, and that we put a lot of effort of making them feeling okay with it. And I think we managed to do that actually in a good way. But yeah, it's a lot of, before the study runs, I think it was over 1.5 years. We got better in Armenia. Once you do it, I guess you really get much faster in that, yeah. We do it next week in Armenia. It's a long procedure, first to the government. So we first present it to the government, and then we present it later also to the communities, to the community leader, and whoever they choose to join, him or her. Probably it's a him. But yeah.
I assume that you've read the public letter in The Guardian a year ago on the whole critique on RCTs, that they're nice and they got a lot of money in the last 10 years, but have they actually done anything besides being the thing to do? So I was wondering, how do you, in the time of increasing critique, how do you still validate that this is the way to go in development?
Mm-hmm. I think this is exactly already a reaction to this, that we trying, I think the main criticism, I mean, first of all, I agree. If you see how many RCTs are produced just by JPOL, and they all pile up. I once had an amazing research assistant. He did a review for me about, I had an offer to do a project on malnutrition. And then he got everything together that was ever done, well published, all the studies that seemed to look really reliable. And it was a mix of anything, right? Everybody changed something. Here the package was changed, it was a different country. And so, I mean, this is, of course, it's a serious criticism. I do think this behavioral insight, this step of using behavioral science, is a step in the direction, because what I didn't say before, but that basically means you focus on mechanism much more. So that's why we had 4 movies in Sudan. I didn't just want to show a best-of movie versus a control. We really could learn if the argument is it a coordination issue or is it a private value issue? And that requires a different program, because in one, I'm just trying to shift a critical mass over the threshold, so to say. In the other one, I can work on an individual basis. And I think that's my reply, first of all, that it still probably is the best if you're really interested in a good test, but it should probably come. And of course, that's expensive. I mean, if I want to test mechanism, I have 4 treatments and not just a control and a program. But I think this is the way where field experiments can also help. I also would argue, if you go back to the study in Sudan, the first one we did had just 200 people. And this is something I also figured out. Often people think immediately about big stuff when they do RCTs. But of course, you can also do it in a lab in the field setting, to get started at least, and do it in a much smaller way. But again, with a focus on also really trying to understand the mechanism behind it, and not just whether it works or it doesn't work.
But then still the time dimension is rather short. I mean, values develop over centuries.
Yeah, of course.
And RCT just runs a couple of years.
Well, that's another question to discuss, right? I mean, this depends very much on the topics. And there are examples where maybe an incentive works. I mean, there is no general answer I can give to that. There are RCTs, they did one here, Stefan did from CSAE, they did one where they showed a 20 minutes movie, and then 6 months later they could still measure a very clear effect. We really were lucky. We could come back 1 week, and then the Sudanese government said, look, guys, this is it. I mean, it was really harsh conditions in Sudan. But of course, it would be wonderful if we could now go back and measure the henna feet there again and be working on all of this. But of course, this is always the same challenge. If you go in the field, if you do this kind of stuff, I mean, that's not surprising that, of course, some programs take longer. I mean, even now in Armenia, it takes 9 months to give birth to a child or whatever. I mean, you shouldn't just have a 2 weeks impact measure afterwards. But I mean, yeah, that's how life is if you do development research, I would say.
Thank you. I was wondering, could you go back to the distribution, maybe a little histogram? Because it looked like there's a lot of within variation.
This one?
Right? Yeah, I think. Is that right? Like, I don't know, to me that's kind of surprising. I was wondering, are they aware that they are not, like that there's a lot of variation between them?
That was interesting thing. I mean, I think this is really only interesting for you if I would have even provided more background. When we started this project, there was only one idea, that everybody cuts and nobody knows how to do better. This was basically the approach. It goes back to this paper from Jerry Mackey, where he really said this is a coordination issue. It's good for fundraising because everybody is somehow locked into this equilibrium. And when we figured out, I mean, what you see here, and we did this now with many more communities. These are actually only 44. We did it with all 144 now. And we figured out that people basically live door to door, who cut and who don't cut. And in the same month when we published this, an economist published a paper using DHS data, also showing, interestingly, that the variation is at the household level, not at the community level, in 13 different African countries. So this is when we started only asking this question. We then later collected data where we asked people, actually, do you have a problem? Let's say you're a cutting family. Are you willing to marry your daughter to a family that doesn't cut, or your son, or whatever? And about 40% in every community said, yeah, we don't care. So we were even more puzzled. And then I just have anecdotes where we asked the 66 data collectors, and we asked them, can you point out in your community who cuts and who doesn't cut? And he said, yeah, of course, I know exactly who is doing what. So it's a lot of new information, and it would now need another study to probably understand that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All of these seemed, you mentioned kind of in passing and quite reasonably with the time constraint that you weren't going to mention all of the qualitative work that went into being able to think about things like the patterns on the children's clothes. But these are obviously very large projects that probably are coordinated between, I would be interested in hearing, are they coordinated between multiple groups or scholars in the same working group? Or how do you kind of bring together this team that's obviously got different expertise both in and across nations? Or what is the team at very least?
Yeah, I should anyway have mentioned that all of this work is done with Ernst Fair and Charles Efferson, so was a biologist and a behavioral economist and me. So yeah, we were not a development department, it was just the three of us. With, of course, an immense, I mean, it was really UNICEF who were the field partner, the implementing partner. And UNICEF, of course, they have a communication for development office. We had an amazing officer there. She had lots of insights in all of this. We did trust the Sudanese talent to write the script, and we really first let him go free, because we thought first we need the perfect story and then we need to make it scientific. So in that way, female gender cutting is a topic where there is a lot of great work done before, so we didn't need to do a lot. There's Bettina Schell Duncan, she's an anthropologist. She did a lot of work on this, trying to find out what campaign, if medicalization is a good thing, if people even care about, if you say this is human rights. She studied backlash and all of this. So this is actually a topic where this was the first RCT and the first serious quantitative approach, but it's a topic where, of course, there is a lot of really great qualitative research. And there was even a woman, she was exactly where we worked in Sudan. She published a book in the early 80s about female gendercutting, an anthropologist in Sudan in exactly that location. So this was all going in.
So the qualitative work was just a foundation that you already had. It wasn't like members of your team, which might be the case in a situation where there wasn't a lot of foundational qualitative work on the topic.
Yeah, I think so. I'm writing now grant proposals on similar topics. So yeah, qualitative research is important. That's right. And I would also now, to be honest, I would say there was research done by UNICEF a bit more ad hoc that went into it. I did now write several grant proposals where I really clearly wrote a qualitative person in, that we really have an anthropologist, somebody on board from the beginning. I don't know, maybe here we were maybe having really enough help from UNICEF at that point, but of course it would be nice to have somebody on board and do that before. Yeah.
Any more? If we don't have any more questions, then I want to thank Sonja again for a really insightful, very interesting talk to close Experiments Day, and also for coming all the way from Switzerland for it. Yeah, so let's give her a round of applause.